And we are here. And we are back. Or I'm back. You're back. Whoever's back is back. Whoever's not is front, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it happens to be, in whatever part of the world you might be. My name's Tad Williams. I'm a writer. I am going to be reading tonight. But first, I'm going to check in and say hello. First, I'm going to move my keyboard so it's not stuck into my midsection. Um, and see who has showed up already to be said hello to. Ronnie is here. Good morning to everyone, he says. Rosalba, good morning. Anna, hello, Anna. And good morning to the Netherlands. Jeremy, you saw my hand waving. It's hard to miss. Besides, it was kind of more of a, I don't know what it was. It was kind of like an Ultraman thing, like Ultraman. I don't know. Maybe it's an old. No, they've brought Ultraman back. You young people should know about Ultraman now. Ruby, hello, Ruby, my semi-former kind of relative. Good to see you. Petra, hello. Chris, hello. Nice to see you too. Juliet, good morning. Christine, good morning. So Christine is in Berlin, if I remember correctly, but Petra is in the Netherlands. Carol, hello, good morning. Oh, Petra's just back from Germany, where she has been. Presumably back means back to Amsterdam or the Netherlands or wherever she was. Hello, Cliff, good to see you. Ilva, hello, my darling. No, I have not seen your mail yet. I have not seen any mail yet. So, Maria Jose, buenos días y bienvenidos. And yes, okay, I think I've got everybody who's here so far. So lovely to see you all. Nothing much to report in this house in the last week, really. Just the same old, pretty much. We all have moments of sadness at our having lost our silly, strange little Chihuahua. My daughter gave me some socks year before last, I think, for Christmas, or something that she had custom done, where you send in a photograph. And so I was putting them on, and they have pictures of all our dogs on them. And one of them's not here anymore, so I was kind of sad, sad to wear socks with Frankie's little Frankie face on them. But we're dealing. We'll be okay. The other dogs are, of course, in need of attention, and they're getting it. So, meanwhile, though, of course, as I think I mentioned to you, our big dog got out, and so now he only goes out of the house on a leash, and it's very complicated. And it's the wrong time of the year, the decade, the whatever, to try and get somebody out to repair fences and stuff like that. So we're still waiting on that. But these are small problems. These are first world problems when you're having trouble getting somebody out to fix the fence. What it probably means is I will probably wind up doing it myself, which if it was a small job would be no big deal. I do lots of those, but we have a big sort of wild area around our house, and the fences are quite long. So finding out where exactly Johnny escaped may be a bit difficult. Anyway, hello, Tony. How are you? Hello, Gregory. Nice to see you too. And Regina. Hello. Hope me and the family are well. Thank you. The family are well. Last I saw the kids, they were all upstairs playing some kind of horror game. If I knew the name, I'd tell you, but I never know things like this because I am one of those people who never really got deeply into games. They came along when I was still in my 20s and stuff. When I was a teenager, my friend had his dad, who was an architect, brought home a Pong game from some building that had been demolished. That was the first Pong game, and I think we might have seen it one time before, in a pizza parlor or something, but this was the mid-1970s. So it was a big deal, and we literally spent the entire summer playing Pong, which is why I never criticized my kids for playing video games. I'm like, God, I had a Pong and spent 3 straight months sitting around with my friend playing Pong every flippin' day. So I can't, when they have so much more interesting variants and variations available these days, I can't really get too high and mighty about it, because I played a ton of Pong, and then I played various games at various, pizza parlors and miniature golf courses and stuff. Tank Commander and Zaxxon and stuff like that. But it didn't, for one thing, I don't like doing what other people want me to do. So when my son first started doing a lot of video games, I would say to him, well, what happens if you drive off this way? And he'd go, you don't do that. I'm going, why not? Why not? I want to go. This was before they had real sandbox games where you could go anywhere, but even the ones that were meant to be like, Super Mario or something, Super Mario Kart, where you're going around on a track. I always want to know, what happens if you drive off the track? What happens if you flip your car? Can you get out and go walking around? No. So I always found those things very frustrating. I find myself that way with certain movies as well, where I'm being so clearly manipulated. Now, of course, and this is the mea culpa and all this, this is what I do for a living myself, and I think that may have something to do with it as well, that I spend so much time manipulating readers that I chafe at being manipulated by someone else. But it also has to do with time and part of what was happening in my life. I didn't really get into RPGs, D&D, anything like that either, although my younger brothers both did. So I was already in this mode of where I just wanted to make things. And as many of you know, before I became a writer, I was doing lots of other different kinds of things. I was working, occasionally as a cartoonist or illustrator, and I did radio, and I did theater, and I played in a band. And so I was all, about, like, I want to make things. And as a result, and this became very clear to me when I went through my shoulder surgery a couple of years ago. And I was basically couldn't work for most of a year. And those of you who've been following my stuff probably were aware of this at the time, because I was whining and complaining about it quite a bit. But I went through almost a year of really just not being able to work. Not so much because I was physically unable, but for most of that time, the pain was chronic and I couldn't think properly. I mean, I could think if you came up to me and said, "What's your name? Where are you?" Things like that. I could still go to the grocery store and go shopping. I wasn't, mentally disabled in any normal sense, but I was unable to concentrate in such a way to do the kind of work that I normally do, which is to hold these complicated things in my head and play with the different plots and characters and timelines and stuff, and move them around in my mind to figure out, to figure out what works best, which is my, what I do for a living. Anyway, so during this time of most of a year when I was just having too much pain and too many problems to be able to work properly, I was, of necessity, just, watching a lot of television and movies and reading a lot of books and stuff, which I do somewhat anyway, obviously. But there came a point where I just was like losing it. And I went out to Deborah, who was in the other room, and said, I can't, I'm not a consumer. I'm not a consumer. I have to make things. That's me. That's what I do. And I think that was always true with me with video games as well. If I'd been making video games, I probably would have been more likely to enjoy them. Or if I was somehow engaged in a dialogue with other makers of similar things, that would have been fine. But in terms of just doing what somebody else set out for me to do, didn't work as well for me, and it never has. I have to make things myself. And in fact, even when I take days off, and I'm sure a lot of you have this experience, especially those of you who are of a creative bent, when I take a couple of days off of work, I finish a manuscript and send it in, and I'm not going to start the next one immediately, I go, I'll have, I've been working 40 straight days or whatever, I'll, have a day off. And damned if by the middle of the day that day, and certainly by the time a second day comes around, I'm already starting to think of like new projects, because that's just the nature of how I am. I need to make things. It's really important to me. And it's more than important. It's just basic. It's part of who I am. I can't even control it. So Anyway, so who? Oh, I see many other people have showed up. So let me say hello to a few of them. Saw Tony. Hello, Tony. I'll say it again anyway. Amalthea. Hello, Amalthea. Oh, from Perth. I've never been to Perth. I've been to the other coast, but one of these days I will make it out to Perth. I would like to see it. And when I was growing up, we had friends who came from there, so I've always had a fond feeling about it. Andres, hello from Ava, and you. Well, hello, and very best to Ava. Ava, as always, who is one of my dear friends and longtime readers, and we've had lots of get-togethers over the years with other members of the various websites and stuff. So Tony, yes, games are much better now. But it was never about the quality of the games. I don't think really. I think it was just about me. Sonia, hello, nice to see you. Michael, a pleasure to see you too. And so, what I'm going to do now that I've bibbled and babbled and wasted a great deal of time is I am going to start reading again from The War of the Flowers. Last thing I was reading last time was a whole long scene, as I recall. First, we'd had a scene where Theo made contact with Poppy Thornapple, daughter of one of the bastards, for lack of a better word, who instigated the attack on the other flower houses and started the new flower war. But Poppy and Theo already had met and had a kind of an odd relationship. So anyway, Theo hooked up with Poppy and they went to dinner and kind of reconciled with the confusions they both had about each other. Now we're reading a chapter called Interlude with Van Gogh Stars, and what's been happening in that one so far is that Theo has been learning more about what is happening politically in the world around him, and especially amongst the people that he is currently kind of hiding out with in this squatter camp out near the outskirts, near the water, on the outskirts of the big fairy city, because there's only one. Anyway, so Cumbers also talked about was talking about the dragons and other things, and that's where we were. So they're talking about the fact that the dragons. Well, I'll just read this last paragraph here. This is Cumber talking. He says all kinds of agreements. I'm not going to do the accent until I'm back in the story properly. All kinds of agreements were signed by all the houses, swearing that these dragons would be kept under control, that they could only be flown by an act of the full Parliament of Blooms, and they could never, never, never be used against fairy folk. To which Theo says, so Hellebore broke that law. Of course, although he got Parliament to rubber stamp it once the smoke had cleared, because the winners make the rules, Theo. A depth of bitterness was in Cumber's words that Theo hadn't heard since the night in the club named Christmas. That's how it always works. They make the rules and they write the histories. So if things end the way they're probably going to, Hellebore and Thornapple and those other lizards will be the heroes, and Button and Primrose will be the villains. You and me too, if they even remember us. 500 years from now, there'll probably be a public holiday to celebrate the anniversary of our executions. Thanks for that pleasant thought, said Theo. Shit, I just thought of something. 500 years. But fairies don't die, do they? I mean, if he wins, Hellebore will probably still be around then, won't he? Celebrating. He'll be fairly old by then. Nobody lives forever. We just endure a lot longer than mortals. But unless someone kills him, yeah, he'll probably be sitting in Strawflower Square watching us being burned in effigy for the 500th time. It was disconcerting that although Coathook was apparently sleeping, remember Coathook is one of the goblins who's rooming with them. It was disconcerting that although Coathook was apparently sleeping deeply, he made no noise or movements at all. Not a snore, not a fidget. Answer me one more question, Theo said quietly. It's purely hypothetical, since I'm probably going to get killed tomorrow anyway. I'm a fairy too, or at least that's what you and the others tell me. Does that mean if I didn't do anything stupid, just kept my head down and my nose clean, I might live for 1,000 years or so as well? Cumber frowned. It's hard to say, because nobody knows all the effects of being raised in the mortal world. You're not entirely like other fairies. I saw some of the physical differences when we were testing you in Daffodil House. Your facial features and body shape have taken on a little mortal coarsening. Excuse the expression, Theo, but you must know what I mean. Yeah, I don't look like an anorexic male model like the rest of these flower folk. But you're not that different either, so it's hard to tell. I'm trying to remember. You didn't have children, did you? That makes a big difference. For a moment, that terrible night flashed through Theo's thoughts. Kat, in her blood-soaked bathrobe, the overworked emergency room intern saying in a weary, offhand way, "It's a miscarriage, of course. There shouldn't be any permanent harm to her ability to conceive, if that's any help at a time like this." "No," he said. "No kids. But what does that have to do with anything?" "Nobody knows for certain. By the time people began to want to test these things in a proper, rigorous way, there weren't enough mortals crossing over to our side, or fairies to the mortal side, to provide the information necessary for a decent study. But the conventional wisdom is that a changeling, a fairy raised by mortals, will still retain most of the fairy birthright, whether he or she knows it or not, until the changeling, in turn, becomes father or mother to a child in the mortal world. Then what remains of the birthright, which can be anything from fairy nature to some kinds of fairy talents and innate knowledge, passes to that child, diminishing a bit with each generation. At least that's what everyone thinks. There hasn't been a chance to test, as I said." Theo sighed. "So there really is a chance I might live to be 1,000 or so." "A chance?" Cumber nodded. "I suppose so." "Well, at least I'll have that to be miserable about when they're torturing me and killing me. Just to keep me distracted." "Does being raised as a mortal make everyone strange?" asked Cumber. "Do you have the expression here, 'you have to laugh to keep from crying'? Well, right now it's more like, 'you have to laugh to keep from throwing up in terror.'" Theo slept only fitfully that night, for several reasons. After falling almost immediately into one of the worst of the shared mind dreams yet, one in which he felt himself helplessly drowning inside his own stolen self, swallowed up by a terrible cold blackness, he escaped into a succession of less frightening episodes, although he was never entirely free of the feeling that he was sharing his thoughts with something foreign, something other. The last dream was something about delivering flowers to his mother in the hospital and trying to tell her that it was really him, her boy Theo, and that he didn't care whether she was his real mother or not. He still loved her, but in the dream she was too far gone in her illness and couldn't understand him. All she could do was stare at the flowers on the bedside table as if they had her hypnotized. It was a sad dream, and usually he didn't remember the sad ones, just the happy ones, making out with some woman he'd lusted after but would never touch in real life, winning the lottery, or the really dreadful ones. Lately, there had been quite a few really dreadful ones, but the chances were that he would not have remembered this one, with his mother's lost face and the drooping flowers beside the hospital bed, if he had not woken up in the middle of it to find a hand across his mouth and another around his throat. "The thing! It's found me!" His heart sped from sleep-slow to terrified in a second, as though someone had pushed the cardiac pedal to the floorboards. He tried to roll away from the clutching hands. The one on his throat came away, but the grip on his mouth only tightened. He clawed at the arm and torso, expecting to find rotting flesh, but his attacker was distinctly whole and distinctly feminine. "Theo! Shh! You'll wake everybody!" "Poppy?" He was stunned. "What are you doing here? Why are you trying to strangle me?" "I'm not, you idiot," she whispered. "I was trying to find your mouth to keep you from shouting, and I slipped." She suddenly let out a little gasp and fell away from him into deeper shadow. "Are you well, Theo Vilmos?" It was Coathook's voice. The goblin had come out of his bedroll across the tent as silently as a cat, and now seemed to have Poppy Thornapple in some kind of chokehold. I think he's going to kill me," she wheezed. Theo could barely hear her. "Don't, Coathook! She's a friend. Let her go." "Are you certain?" Yes, let her go." Suddenly, Poppy came sprawling into his lap, knocking him back onto his rumpled blanket. The other 3 residents of the tent were beginning to stir now as well. He pushed her toward the tent flap. "Wait for me outside." "Theo?" asked Cumber, muzzy with sleep. What's... It's okay, really. Just someone with a message for me. Coathook was looking out for all of us, but it's a false alarm." By the thin moonlight leaking in through the flap, Theo could see the yellow eyes staring back at him. It was like being watched by the devil himself, but he knew that if the intruder had been anyone other than Poppy, he would have been helplessly grateful for the goblin's vigilance and excellent night vision. "Thanks," he said. Coathook nodded, blinked, then slithered back across the tent and under his blanket once more. Theo took a moment to catch his breath. His hands were still shaking, and then followed Poppy out through the flap. The fairy moon was almost full, a vast white onion sinking toward the horizon, so bright that even the pyrotechnic stars were glared into the background. Washed in its light, Button's Bridge loomed above the flat emptiness at the far end of the camp like a phantom castle out of an old folk tale, making its once-in-a-century appearance on some misty Scottish heath. Before Theo had even stood all the way upright, she had her arms around him. She kissed his face, then pulled back, her dark eyes wide and serious. "Is it too terrible I've come? I was half afraid I'd find you with some other woman." He didn't think it was terrible at all. She felt wonderful against him. He kissed her for an answer, then suddenly stopped and leaned back. "But how did you find me?" "I have a friend who works in the Parliamentary Bureau of Mirror Service. She's having an affair with her boss, and she has access to records that is simply scandalous. It wasn't that hard for her to trace back the call you had your friend make to me the other day. But you already knew I was in the camp." "I didn't trace it back to the camp. I traced it back to your friend." She lifted the small wand she used as a phone. It glowed with the faintest silvery light. "See? I had it charmed to show me when it was getting close to the person who made the call. I was hoping that if you weren't in the same tent, he'd at least know where you stayed, but there you were." He was shocked and disturbed. He'd underestimated the technology of fairy again. "But that's terrible. That means anyone can trace us." "Why? Have you been calling a lot of other girls? Because if you haven't, then you only have to worry about me, and I'm obviously not going to turn you in." She gave him a look, half suspicious, half amused. "There aren't any other calls, are there?" No, that was the first time I tried that. But what if your friend in the What's-It Bureau? She won't think twice about it. I told her a man with an attractive voice got my shell by accident, and I was curious what he looked like. She's so busy agonizing over what's going on with her and her boss, she's probably forgotten already. Feel better?" "Yeah, I guess so. I was just... See, I made Streety do it. I'd feel terrible if something happened to him because of me." Now she did look amused. "You and your obligations. You may be of fairy blood, but it's certainly not from any of the high houses, not if you spend your time worrying about things like that. Even the relatively nice boys like Lander Foxglove would step over their own dying grandmothers to get into an interesting party. But you're not like that." Although, remembering how she had spoken about her own brother's murder, he couldn't be sure. "I don't want to be," she said seriously. "Sometimes I think I'm not. And sometimes I think I can't change it. It's just the world I grew up in. She put her arm through his and pulled him down the path atop the levee, away from the camp. People like my father and his friends, I'm not talking about the hellebores, they're completely mad. I'm talking about the ones that everyone thinks of as normal flower types. They don't waste their strength caring much for anyone except themselves. I used to think that was normal, but every now and then one of the servants or one of my more distant relatives would be different. Do something simply because it was nice. Be kind to me just because I was a sad little girl, not because they wanted something from my father. One of my aunts actually stood up to him, told him he treated his children worse than he treated the servants, and he treated the servants like animals. That was almost the only time I'd ever seen him surprised. Wow, what happened? He killed her. She gave an angry little laugh. Oh, not in an obvious way. But he ruined her life, destroyed her husband's business, spread poison about her all through our social circle, got her children thrown out of their school. Eventually, her husband left her and she went to the well. The well? She killed herself. But really, he murdered her. My father murdered her. If she'd said those things about him in private, he wouldn't have cared. He would have laughed, probably, and she thought it worth mentioning as though it were something bad. But she said it in public, in front of the lower orders who are supposed to worship him, and that he couldn't allow, so he destroyed her. That's when I started hating him. She stopped suddenly. I don't want to talk about this anymore, Theo. I know you're going after your friend. I don't want to talk about my horrible family when I don't know how much time we have before I head off to get myself killed too. Don't say things like that. She threw her arms around him and squeezed hard like a drowning swimmer, and Theo suddenly understood how a rescuer could be turned into a victim. He wished he had spoken in a less petty, self-pitying way, but at the moment he felt caught between duty and common sense, neither of which were things he really wanted running his life in the first place. They certainly hadn't been big parts of the Theo Vilmos master plan before now. Poppy still held him. I couldn't stand it when you walked away the other night. I could just tell you were planning to do something heroic and stupid. I was? I mean, you could tell that? Yes, you had this determined air that they always have in the mirror plays. Lord Rose going off to fight the goblins, kissing his little daughters goodbye, or Memnon Alder on the eve of the Frost War. Theo hadn't really thought of himself as determined, let alone heroic. But for this instant it was nice to think it might be so. Maybe all heroes are basically cowards like me, he thought. And it's doing whatever you have to do anyway that's important. I mean, if you aren't scared, if you're just completely oblivious to danger, how heroic is that? Still, he didn't quite feel ready to put himself in the camp of the determined and brave just yet. It went against too many years of self-image. He turned his attention to something much more immediate and much more pleasant. When he had finished kissing her, she took his hand and began to lead him down the levee once more, the moonlight so strong Theo and Poppy even cast shadows. Where are we going? He asked. I'll show you. She led him on until the camp was just a clot of darkness lit by a few fires huddled along the banks of the river. The big moon was disappearing into the horizon like a leaking balloon. Poppy rucked up her long skirt and sat cross-legged on the damp ground, then beckoned Theo to join her. The wind had picked up. He shivered a little and wished once again that he hadn't been forced to trade away his leather jacket to a troll, however sensible the bargain. When he was seated, she put her cool hands on either side of his face. She seemed to have retreated a little, her face set in that now familiar flower mask. I want you To love me, Theo, but only if you mean it. He shook his head. I don't know enough. That is, I wouldn't want you to. That's not what I mean, whatever you're going to say. I want you to love me with your body. Your heart, well, that will make its own choices. But I don't want you to be my lover because you feel sorry for me or because you think it will make up for something else you did wrong. He took her hand. I I don't know how much of me there really is, Poppy, but what there is, well, right now it's yours. Good. And now she let the mask slip a little. Then come back and kiss me. Kiss me again and let's forget all about the horrible things for a while. Love me. He got up on his knees to kiss her and found himself shivering again. But it's so cold and not very private. She laughed. I brought a pavilion. A what? Watch. She took something out of the pocket of her pants and held it out to him. It was a small sachet about the size of a tea bag. A very useful charm. Will you think I'm terrible if I admit I bought it this afternoon, planning to come find you? She closed it in her hand and broke it open with her fingers, then clambered to her feet, bent over and began to sprinkle the shimmery dust in a wide circle around them. The air just above the line of powder on the ground seemed to waver. It might have been a trick of the dying moonlight, but Theo felt pretty sure it wasn't. The effect spread and traveled upward with surprising speed, coming together over their heads at a point some 6 or 7 feet above the ground. You mean no one can see us now? He looked around. The walls distorted the light like thick glass, turning the stars wobbly, but they were by no means opaque. He also didn't feel much warmer. The whole experience was exciting, but strange. He shivered again, not entirely from the cold. Nobody can see in. In fact, unless they're standing right next to it, they won't even see the pavilion at all. She reached out and clasped his hands. You really are cold, aren't you? I'm sorry, Theo. The store where I got it only had these inexpensive ones. We'll have to warm it with our own body heat. But that shouldn't be too bad, should it? She shrugged off her coat and pulled her sweater over her head, then undid her blouse. She was wearing nothing underneath but a thin silver-white chain around her neck. Her pale skin seemed to glow like the moon. He reached out his hand and touched her breast. It's not warm in here yet, though, is it? She laughed, but she sounded nervous. Look! Goosebumps! He pulled her to him then, and by the time he had puzzled out the strange mechanics of the fastenings on her other clothes, you had to tap on them at least 4 times, he had forgotten about the temperature, about other eyes, about nearly everything except the black-haired woman he was kissing and the glossy underwater stars gleaming above them. And he was fast forgetting about the stars as well. At one point she pulled back from him and said, a little breathlessly, I have some other charms as well. For what? It was hard to use spoken language after long moments of nearly perfect silent communication. A thought occurred to him. Birth control? I mean for not having babies? Black iron, no, she said and giggled. We learn those charms with our first blood, and I've already done mine for this moon. No, these are just love-making charms. Little ones to make things, I don't know, more interesting. They were in this display at the apothecary. She looked away, suddenly shy. I just thought you might. I don't need anything but you. Whether because of heightened senses or the close space inside the charmed circle, the smells of her skin and hair were as powerful as any drug. And I don't want anything but you. This is magic. Pardon, science. Enough for me. I'm so glad you said that. And then they stopped talking again. The Van Gogh stars glittered like snowflakes in the cold sky, but inside the pavilion the air had grown warm as deepest summer. Chapter 35. A sort of reunion. Another dream of a lost parent had caught him up. He was surrounded by clouds again, a hospital corridor full of smoke, or perhaps it was Daffodil House. The ghostly shapes in the halls might have been ash-covered victims, or only patients in white hospital gowns. He was looking for his father, shouting for him, but not for Pete, which Theo had called him in that awkward 20-something stage of trying to find some common ground, or even Dad. Daddy! Daddy! Where are you? He thought he saw him through the haze, turning the corner at the end of the hall, slump-shouldered, balding on top, wearing one of the Hawaiian shirts that he put on every Saturday morning as if to prove to himself that the weekend had really come. As a teenager, Theo had been astonished to realize that to the old man a Hawaiian shirt was actually cool, a symbol of some kind of tiny rebellion against the gray suits, white shirts, and ugly ties. Daddy? He realized, or at least the Theo in the dream realized, that he had never said goodbye, not properly. He had clutched his father's hand while he lay in the hospital bed after his stroke, but if Pete Vilmos had been aware of his son and his wife in those last hours, he had given no sign. Theo hurried down the darkening corridor. It seemed increasingly important he tell his father something of what he had learned and done in the years since the old man's death. Prove to him that life was worth it, that the mind-numbing years of work Pete Vilmos had endured to put food on the table and toys under the Christmas tree meant something. But he couldn't think of what to say. There's nothing to tell, is there? I'm nobody, just like he was. Still, he was desperate to catch up with that shuffling figure. Daddy? A voice came back to him through the smoke, thinned by distance. Theo? Theo, where are you? He struggled toward the sound, but something had caught him. Hands were pulling at him. The other patients must be trying to hold him back, unless they were victims, burned sufferers trying to climb past him and down the stairs to safety. Had the dragon come back? He fought without strength. He could still hear his father's voice, but it seemed to be receding. Theo, wake up! It was another voice, a woman's voice. Theo, someone's looking for you. He came up shuddering, tangled in his own discarded clothes. Poppy had her arms around him. There's someone out there, she said. He shook his head, clumsily trying to assemble the details into a coherent whole, but having little luck. Then the voice came again, and for an instant he thought it really was his father, or his father's unsettled spirit. His heart lurched and his skin tingled. Theo, are you out here? Oh my God, it's Cumber. I completely forgot. I'm supposed to... He sat up and began to drag on his pants. Where is he? Why can I hear him so clearly? Because he's probably only a few yards away. She was naked and seemed a little shy. It was very distracting to be here with this lovely, unclothed, near stranger while someone was searching for him. The filtered light of the stars played unevenly across her milky skin as she sat up. Then why doesn't he... He remembered. The charm. Just step outside. Then he'll see you. She tried to smile. Still hopping as he pulled up his pants, he passed through the wall of the pavilion without feeling anything until he was suddenly engulfed in the chill of the night. Cumber was a few dozen paces down the levee, his back turned until Theo called him. By the grove, you startled me, the Farrister said. Where have you been? I was terrified. I thought that dead thing had come and taken you. We have only a little more than an hour until dawn. He squinted. What are you doing wandering around out here half naked? I'll explain later. I'm sorry, I forgot. I'll meet you back at the tent in a few minutes. Cumber said, shook his head. Not there. Down by the river at this end of camp. You'll see why when you get there. You really had me worried. I've been looking for you all over. Are you sure you're all right? Fine. Sorry for the trouble. Go ahead now, and I'll catch up with you. The Ferrisher gave him a strange look. Are you sure everything is all right? Really? Go on. Cumber nodded slowly, then turned and walked back up the levee. Even though he was only a yard from it, it took Theo a few moments to locate the pavilion again. With the moon down, the slight blurring of the air that marked its presence was hard to distinguish from the mists rising off the river. Crossing the barrier was much different this time, moving from the cold into the warm and back into the sense of their lovemaking. You have to go. She had put her blouse back on, but stopped there. He wanted to lie down beside her and kiss her smooth leg, the taut skin of her side just above her hip, but knew that if he did, he would never be able to make himself get up again. I do, he said, I really do. Button seemed to think it was very important we leave before dawn. Who's Button? He hesitated. He trusted her now. Of course he did, but he did not want to add to her danger either. What had Button said? We cannot tell what we do not know. He's a friend of mine from the camp, a goblin. I want to make you stay, she said. Make you want to stay, that is. Again, the sad smile. But I know I shouldn't. If you weren't the kind of person who is going to help his friend, you wouldn't be the person that I feel this way about. Is this how it works? He wondered. The magnitude of what was before him came rushing back, dreams and even Poppy's presence no longer enough to distract him. He felt weak and ill. Is this how you get less shallow? You do the right thing, no matter how it feels and how much you wish you could run away, then everyone thinks you're a grand guy? Everybody cries at your funeral? But there was something heartening in it, too, even if it was a lesson he was learning too late to be of much use, a path toward reinvention. She thinks that's who I am, so that's who I am to her. I don't want to leave you, was all he could think of to say, but I have to. I know. She had put her mask of control back on, but it was not entirely effective, and she could not meet his eye. I want you to have something. Well, two things. One of your gloves to wear on my lance when I ride into battle? She did look up then, puzzled. Why would you be taking a lance? I'm not. It's just what the knights of my world used to do with gifts from their lady loves. Well, you'd better take more care of these than putting them on some lance. She handed him something about the size and shape of a long lipstick tube. Use this and call me if you need me. I mean it, Theo. If you need anything, I'll get it for you. If you need me, I'll be there, no matter what. He looked at the small silvery wand. I may not get a chance to make any calls for a little while, but thanks. After whatever happens, it will be nice to be able to reach you without having to give Streety a headache. She smiled, but her eyes were damp. You'd better call me. That's all I'll say. And I want you to have this too. She tugged a thin silver chain and pendant out of the neck of her blouse, the one thing she had kept on, all during the night. Now she took it off and held it out to him. What he had thought might be a small coin, he now saw was a moon, one crescent of it made from something like polished opal. It's a chip from my mother's family moundstone. She gave this to me. What does it do? Do? It doesn't do anything. It's something she gave me. One of the only things she ever gave me. It's really important to me, Theo, and I'm giving it to you to make sure you come back to me. He had expected some fairy charm, some magical talisman to protect against danger, and for a moment he was almost disappointed. He suspected he was going to need all the help he could get. Then he realized the significance of what she was giving to him, and he felt something expand inside his chest, a quiet rapture that was bigger and more powerful than even the heights of their lovemaking. "Thank you," he managed to say. He carefully lifted the necklace over his head, let the moon fall onto his chest. "Thank you. I'll do my best to come back to you." She laughed, but it was raw with pain and anger. "This is so wretched. I knew there was a reason I didn't want to fall in love anymore. But I never thought." She struggled for composure. "Kiss me and go, Theo. Hurry." "Will you be able to get back all right?" "Black iron, will you just kiss me and get out of here? My heart is breaking." "Mine too," he said, and was surprised and frightened to realize it was true. Cumber was waiting for him on the banks of the dark river, but he was not alone. "Coathook?" Theo had to look twice to make sure. He was still not entirely adept at telling one goblin from another. "What are you doing here?" "Button says we shouldn't go through the city to get to the place we're going," Cumber told Theo. "Even just along the edges. He says it's better to go by water." "That doesn't explain why you're here," Theo said to Coathook. "Because I know how to paddle a boat without making as much noise as a drowning troll." The goblin's slot eyes gleamed with reflected starlight. "You don't." "Oh. Well, thanks." Coathook pointed to the open boat, which was little more than a canoe. "Come." "Where's Streety?" Theo asked as they pushed off and into the sluggish current. "I was kind of hoping he could come with us in case there were some, I don't know, alarms or magic fences." "Button says he needs him today," Cumber said, "and that he doesn't think getting in will be our biggest problem anyway." Theo let that sink in as they made their way silently up the moon flood to the point where it widened as they met the newer channel of the river. Theo and Cumber ate a breakfast of bread and sweet cheese the Farrisher had brought, while Coathook guided the boat across the breadth of the flow and up close to the bank on the far side. Theo could see houses on slender stilts looming above them, some with lights burning in the windows. Below them, like barnacles on the pilings of a dock, smaller and far humbler dwellings clustered on the river shore. "Who lives here?" Theo asked in a whisper. "Niskies," said Cumber. Coathook silenced them both with a motion of his clawed hand. A few larger boats were anchored in the coves and in marinas, shiny, many-oared things that looked more like ancient triremes or even upside-down centipedes than like modern ships, but no other traffic was moving on this section of the river. Theo wondered if that was normal, or if it was something to do with the Flower War curfew. He couldn't help wishing there were a few other vessels plying the channel down toward Is, if only to make their own boat less conspicuous. Although Coathook kept to the edge of the river and, as he had promised, plied his paddle as quietly as a knife cutting warm butter, Theo could not help feeling terribly exposed. Finally, as they turned a bend in the moon flood and saw the whole expanse of Is stretching before them, a black immensity barely touched even by Fairy's exuberant starlight, Coathook took his paddle out of the water. "After this, no more talking," he said so quietly it barely carried. "But Button says to tell you Today might be a good day to go on to Helbor House. What? Theo had trouble keeping his voice low. Well, what does that mean? Coathook shrugged. No more talking now. We are close. The word close, Theo decided, must have a very odd meaning to goblins, since they paddled on for at least another quarter of an hour. The section of riverbank they could see through the hanging mists was studded with broken-down industrial buildings, once exuberant fairy versions of old warehouses and canneries. A few of the structures were still apparently occupied. Signs glowed sputteringly here and there like dying fireflies. End of the rainbow storage, or grotto for you. But the rest seemed long disused, and with the first lightening of the sky, Theo could make out painted advertisements, sometimes with one sign flaking off to reveal an earlier message. They were close enough to the bank that he could even read some of them. King Kilpie Ocean Goods, proclaimed one, illustrated by a dim, rather frightening picture of a fishy humanoid with a crown and a basket full of fish and shellfish. Lawful purveyor by their majesties' charter of the fruits of Ys. Something slapped at the water, and Theo looked over, startled that Coathook should suddenly lose his touch. But the goblin was looking back at him as though the noise had been Theo's doing. Something in the dark water beside the boat caught Theo's eye. A little sprinkling of pale blue-green lights was moving just below the surface. For a moment he thought it was a parade of glowing fish, but the movement was different than any shoal of fish he had seen on a television nature show. He found himself watching in fascination as the ordered glimmer moved closer to the surface just below him. But it was another long moment before he realized that what he was looking at was a human shape, pacing them in the water with effortless movements. It rolled toward him, the face only inches beneath the surface, glowing like the dial of a watch. The eyes met his, a woman's eyes, he could see now, but huge compared to the rest of the narrow face. Even with all its strangeness, it was a very lovely face. The staring eyes were black, so very black. Blacker even than the water, and they seemed to be getting larger and larger as he leaned toward them. Larger and larger. Instead of going over into the inviting darkness, he was yanked backward into the boat so abruptly that the air whooshed out of his lungs and he bumped his head on the boat's other rail as he fell. The whole craft swayed alarmingly as he struggled onto the bench again. The swift pressure of Coathook's talons still hurt his arm, even after the goblin had let go. Cumber had not moved, but was watching with startled eyes. Theo looked at his companions, then back at the glimmering shape beneath the surface. It had slowed its pace, and they were beginning to pull away. The lean, predatory features no longer looked quite so human. He thought he could feel a certain disappointment emanate from it that lingered in his mind like a faint odor even after the swimming shape vanished into the depths. Theo was trembling and breathing hard, as though he had actually been pulled into the water and had been forced to struggle for his life. The nymph band around his wrist seemed hot and tight, chafing his skin. He nodded at Coathook to show that he was grateful, that he understood. He thought he understood, anyway. He suspected that the thing in the water had been much more interested in him than his two companions. There's such a fine line here, he thought, between a useful reminder and getting yourself killed. Or worse. Coathook's paddling was so smooth and silent that Theo did not realize for some moments that the goblin had stopped, and that the boat was stopping too. They were in among the pilings of a dock, but although what he could see of the dock was made of wood, the posts were cylinders of ancient stone that loomed through the river mist like a half-submerged Stonehenge. A soaked and deteriorating wooden ladder tied to the nearest one led up through a hatch toward the purpling sky. The goblin drew his hand across his mouth again, reminding them to be silent, then pointed to the ladder. As Theo got unsteadily to his feet and clambered up, moving far enough for Cumber to climb out behind him, Coathook made another sign, this one unrecognizable, and then turned the little boat around. Within a few heartbeats, he had disappeared into the royal of fog. Theo looked down at Cumber with wide eyes. The Farisher seemed almost as alarmed as Theo was, but only shrugged. Perhaps he had known Coathook was not going to wait for them, but it was strange that the goblin had not even mentioned coming back to pick them up. Theo found it hard not to feel a bit betrayed. "What do you want?" he chided himself. "You're not the center of his universe, or Button's either. You wanted to go and get yourself killed trying to help a friend. Well, they helped you get here. Now you're on your own." He climbed the ladder, pausing to gather his courage before thrusting his head through the open hatch. The catwalk of weathered timbers was empty, and the warehouse wall featureless, a long stretch of salt-stained boards with only the smallest remnant of its original coat of white paint. He wanted to ask Cumber how this broken-down barn could be the headquarters of one of the most dangerous creatures in Fairy, but if the creaking ladder hadn't already alerted the occupants that someone was out here, he didn't want to do its job for it. The Farisher came up behind him and crouched. Together they listened to the slap of waves on the pilings below, the cries of water birds, and briefly, a distant voice rising above the other noises in a snatch of quaveringly alien song. Theo took a breath and stood, then followed the catwalk around toward the side of the building away from the water. They were at the end of a long stone pier that pushed out at least 100 yards into the moon flood, just a short distance from where it joined Is. A line of ramshackle buildings in different shapes and sizes covered the pier all the way to the end, as though some weird circus train had ground to a shuddering, bumping halt a moment before it would have rolled off into the water. But if the building they were to enter was the train's engine, it did not look the part. It was a featureless rectangle, with no visible windows. In the pre-dawn light, its high blank sides gave it the look of some ancient stone slab, the foundations of an antediluvian temple where screaming victims had once been sacrificed. "Steady," Theo told himself. "Don't make it worse than it is." But the windowless walls disturbed him. Who lived like that? Who would build a long, low box like this at the end of a pier and leave no openings to the ocean breeze, no view of the estuary and the sea? He suddenly saw the building as something different. Not a temple, not an edifice at all, but the shell of some immense angular thing. Instead of being in character with the rest of the structure, the door set in the side of the building was a small and quite ordinary thing of wind-scoured wood with a single tarnished bronze handle, as though someone had built a storage closet into the base of the Sphinx. Theo looked at Cumber, who seemed one loud noise away from running for his life. Not that Theo blamed him. In fact, I'd be right behind him. He reached out his trembling hand toward the latch. "This is crazy," he thought. It's a warehouse. Even if it's full of monsters or guys with guns or whatever, on the outside it's just a warehouse, and I'm not psychic. Why should I feel like I'm about to walk through the gates of Hades? Before he could touch it, the door silently swung open. Theo gasped and jumped back, half expecting something slimy and otherworldly to stretch a tentacle out of the darkness and yank him in, but no such appendage appeared. The door remained open. The darkness beyond remained impenetrable. And I think for tonight we're going to stop there because the action of the chapter, such as it is, begins in earnest fairly quickly after that. So might as well stop there with the door just opening. Yeah, it's a cliche. But that's the thing about cliches, you know? They can still be fun. Anyway, so it is now 3 o'clock, and I'm about to shuffle off to, well, not exactly to sleep, because I can't ever go to sleep for like, excuse me, for like 2 hours after I do this, because it just takes that long to come down. You know, this is a little bit like the old days. It feels a little bit like doing theater or playing a band show or something, you know, just because you get up to do it. And then once you get up to do it, you know, this is why, you know, the nights after high school plays and stuff, all the kids go out to some local restaurant or something, because you're just so full of energy. And I know this personally very well, both from my own somewhat checkered theatrical career and that of our kids, who definitely did the theater thing as well. So, and that's what I'm like after I finish here. So I'm usually up for a couple of hours trying to just let myself calm back down. Anyway, so that's it. I'll come back and read more, and we will get to spend some time with the remover of inconvenient obstacles tomorrow at 7 p.m. For those of you who cannot make the same times, I will reiterate something that has been iterated ad nauseum probably already, which is that all of these are recorded. They're available on YouTube. They're available still. The recordings themselves are on my Facebook pages, both of them, and on my Twitter feed, and I believe they're also probably available through tadwilliams.com, but I'm not 100% on that one. I can't remember, but I think so. Anyway, so we have come to the end of our time together tonight. I will see you again tomorrow at 7. I thank you all, as always, for good wishes and for your attendance and sharing some time with me. We're like practically a year pretty soon. Every week, twice a week. Well, the first few weeks it was just once a week, but this has been going on for a while. So some of you out there, you need to get some kind of professional help if you're coming to hang out with me every week. You definitely have problems. No, I'm very pleased to have you all. It's a thrill. So anyway, with that, I am going to say what I always say, which is please take care of yourselves. Take care of your loved ones, your family and friends, but also be aware of the people around you who might not be having a great time. The pandemic has been tough on almost everybody, except for a small coterie of billionaires, and who the hell cares what they have to deal with? Poor, suffering billionaires. But everybody else is having different kinds of difficult times. So see if you can help somebody out. Call somebody up that you haven't talked to in a while and just check in with them. Whatever. We can all help each other out. That's the basic point here. And until tomorrow at 7, well, later today at 7 p.m., I will once again thank you. Ilva says, yes, of course they are on your message board, Tad. And then she says, she wrote it out, but it's like she's shocked with me. I don't know why anybody would be shocked that anything that I don't know. Good Lord, I know so few things about what's going on in the world around me, and I know so much about so many uninteresting and unimportant things. I can tell you all kinds of crazy things about all kinds of crazy issues and all kinds of crazy areas of study. But in terms of like actual things, like where's my clean shirts, not a chance. And that's not because somebody else does them for me. I'm not, don't get me wrong. That's not me sitting around yelling at my poor beleaguered spouse or children. I mean, just because I put things places and I forget because I'm walking around in an authorial haze most of the time. Anyway, and I'm babbling again. So there you go. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you all virtually, and love and best wishes from all of us here at the Rancho Beal Williams at our compound. It's not really a compound, but I like that. We lived across the street from a compound back before in our last house, an actual compound owned by a Silicon Valley billionaire, which I'll tell you about sometime. And we could actually go and stand on our porch sometimes and look across the street, and dimly past all the fences and everything, we could see the armed guards in their Jeeps driving around with canines, like canine guard dogs in the car with them, and every now and then they'd get out with their flashlights and run around in the forest out there while we were just watching, going like, man, this is weird. Here we are, kind of fairly semi-normal people, and we're living in. We had Larry Ellison's place was just down the road from us. Steve Jobs was living near us too, so much so that when back in the '90s, when we first moved in, the end of the '90s, Bill Clinton would come to visit. Jobs, when he was in the area doing something and was president, I think. Yeah, still president. And the streets around us, these little tiny winding woodside streets, would be just literally chock-a-block with police vehicles in every direction. Just dozens of them lined up. And so here we were living in a it was a nice house, but it was like a normal house, right? But we were surrounded by these like billionaires. It was really weird. Anyway, but living in Woodside and the billionaires around us and all that is another story for another day. So once again, good night from my end. Be well, all of you, and I will see you in a few hours, I guess. Okay, thanks.